Um, Actually, I hope people will ask questions in the middle. There's various points that are good points. It is a real pleasure to be back at WINLAB. This is one of my favorite places to come, as I think it's clear to everybody the research that's going on here is among the very best in the world, and it also has a very, very strong practical bent, which I personally enjoy. That combination is almost unparalleled. Ray is kind of underplaying his own role in Genie. For many years, he was the lone voice that was arguing that wireless was going to be a very, very important part of the future Internet. If you can imagine that Ray had to carry that argument himself, but carry it he did. And I think it's now very widely understood that that is true. Okay, let me give a brief talk on the global environment for network innovations, Genie. The beginning of the talk, this is kind of a difficult audience, as some of the people here I think have never heard of Genie, have no idea what it is. Other people are actually leaders in building Genie, and so those of you who understand what Genie is probably better than I do, you can do email at the beginning, and then it'll start to get to newer news about 10 or 15 minutes into the talk. Okay, here's the outline. Kind of what is Genie, what's currently going on, and then what do we see going on both within the Genie project and more broadly, because I think actually a lot of stuff is starting to happen at this point, and it's kind of interesting. This is the basic space that the Genie project operates in. It is attempting to open up research in global networks, global scale, planetary scale computing and networking infrastructure. We're all living inside the Internet right now. All of us use it in all our lives. Those of us who have children, I think our children use it even more than we do. And it's opening up some very, very interesting new research areas. There are basic science issues. Those of us who build large-scale distributed systems for our living realize there's no civil engineering handbook we can go to. There's no book of equations about how to build a stable distributed system. And that's a little bit frightening for those of us who build such things for a living. So those are deep science issues. We simply don't understand these systems. I think many of us believe that there are very important innovation issues here. There are getting to be substantial barriers, in my view, to at-scale experimentation with new architectures and global networks, new services and new technologies. In essence, kind of the center of the network is becoming closed to innovation, or only very large established companies can innovate in that space. And so I view this as an important issue for the US and indeed for the world. And then finally, there are some really deep society issues in this space. All of us are increasingly relying on the Internet for everything. Our banking systems, our power systems, on and on and on. But I think all of us are getting less and less certain that we can trust its security, privacy, or resilience. So this is the general space in which Genie is working. In response to these issues, the National Science Foundation set up a very interesting research area called Network Science and Engineering. And I won't read the fine print, but they are funding research that crosses all three of these areas: the science areas, the technology and innovation areas, and the society areas. And they're looking at new research that kind of is looking into this entire space. Personally, I believe this is a fantastic area, very important and very poorly understood. In parallel with that effort, the NSF began to stand up this project called the Global Environment for Network Innovations, GENI. And GENI is a suite of research infrastructure that's designed to support experimentation in this space, experimentation in network science and engineering. The infrastructure first started taking shape around 2005-2006 when a dozen leading researchers, including Ray, tried to figure out what are the basic elements of Genie. And you can see there's three major parts. First, it's envisioned as being very deeply programmable. So I think you could argue that the innovation in the Internet comes because anyone can install any software they want on their laptop or their end computer. If you know how to write software, you can write anything you want. Otherwise, you just buy it. But you cannot do that deep into the network. You can't program the routers. You can't program the clouds. That whole space is kind of closed. Genie envisions, let's have it all open, in particular so researchers can program all the way through the network. Every part. The routers, the switches, the clouds, the firewalls, everything is programmable. The second major aspect is that everything is virtualized. So the network is shared among a number of different research experiments that run in parallel with end-to-end virtualization as a way of keeping these experiments separate from each other. These are called slices in the Genie terminology. And finally, it is envisioned as being a deeply federated infrastructure. So different organizations own and operate different parts of Genie. This is rather unusual for research infrastructure. Usually it's owned and operated by one group. But as you try to go to at-scale experimentation, this is the only way you can get there, is by having different parts of the infrastructure owned and operated by different groups. Think of the internet, for example. No one group owns and operates the internet. So as you start getting to very substantial scales, this becomes a necessity. In addition, the kinds of technologies that are used in Genie will vary over time. You know, the internet does not pick one technology and then use that forever. There's constantly new technology bubbling up. So it's important that Genie do the same. This is a highlight of the current status. I'm going to return and dive in again in a second. But there's currently about 50 U.S. campuses engaged in Genie and 2 of the national research backbones. The U.S. is lucky enough to have both Internet 2 and National Lambda Rail as national research backbones. So this is kind of the geographic footprint of Genie at the moment. And here's kind of the logo footprint of Genie. There are 4 groups who are really kind of leading the conceptual effort of figuring out the software control framework for this. They range from Ben, which is coming out of North Carolina and Duke. Orbit, you know all about. The WINLAB group is actually a major force in trying to shape the control structure for Genie. Planet Lab, which is a well-known worldwide system coming out of Princeton. And Proto-Genie, which is the new version of EmuLab from the University of Utah, for those of you who work in that space. There are a number of academic groups, and then at the bottom, a key goal of the Genie Project Office is to engage as much industry as possible in this. The reason is, as we start going to at-scale build-outs, you cannot do an at-scale build-out with graduate student hardware. The hardware is going to come from industry. And so a key goal is to have Genie-enabled hardware as quickly as possible so that we can do our builds using that Genie-enabled hardware. Okay, let me give a brief comic book about, like, if we had one of these things, what would we do with it? And actually, this is the year where it's becoming, this is crunch time. That we hope that some of the NSF Future Internet Architectures projects will in fact employ Genie to do their research. But let me give you the basic idea first. So here we have a researcher, and this particular researcher has a great idea. You actually may hear talks like this today, which is, hey, the original internet was designed to connect one computer to another. That was a technological feat to get computers all across the U.S. talking to each other. But nowadays, we know how to do that. What it's really all about nowadays is people and content. So this researcher's great idea is, look, let's fundamentally re-architect global networks so that people and content are the first-class entities in these networks. Well, if you go to the research conferences, the audience reaction to this is very predictable. It's kind of a, yeah, that will never work. And then there's kind of a long list of, well, no, I don't think that's going to work. And so this has been the pattern that we've been stuck in the research field for about the past 15 years, maybe 20 years. Someone has a really interesting idea. Other people say, I don't think so. And that's the end of the conversation, right? Then we circle back and do the whole thing all over again. Okay, but now let's imagine that people are actually starting to use Genie. So because this guy has kind of a content-centric networking idea, let's give him a slice of Genie, not all of Genie, but he'll get his own virtualized slice that includes, say, several large data centers because he has content, and wireless coverage, say cell phone coverage over a few American cities, and good capacity backbone to link them together, and let him start programming this. So we hope he tries it a little bit in the lab first, but then he actually downloads his software into these data centers, into the programmable routers, into the cellular base stations, and begins to run his software in those actual systems. Now, he doesn't get all of Genie. He just gets a slice of Genie while he's doing this. A key point really should be Genie is very well instrumented so that you can actually get measurements. This has been a big problem for the network research community for some time. It's been very, very hard to get real measurements out of large-scale systems. Okay, well, this particular guy, his research twists and it turns, and he thought he was doing one thing, but then he wound up, this over there was actually a little bit more interesting. And he winds up, he's doing something kind of akin to location-based social networks. One of the really interesting ideas in Genie, one of the reasons I got very interested in this, is real people are using his experiment. So when I say it's a cellular system over a city or over a bunch of campuses or what have you, that's so that real people can kind of tune in and start using his experiment. So he may get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of real users in the course of this. That's something that I think if you're going to be exploring network science and engineering at scale, people are very, very important. So Genie does not envision that all the work is going to be traffic generators or emulators or what have you. It is a way to get to large, large numbers of real people who can then begin to use these experimental services. So this, yeah, please. Yeah, I will get to that in just, how is a key question, right? So I'll get to that. Okay, so this particular trajectory, so this is the concept, right? And then we'll say how we're doing. This particular trajectory ends with this guy spinning it out, doing a startup, and away he goes, right? It turns out his experiment was not really incompatible with the internet at all. Well, so a lot of people think, oh, I get it. So Genie will enable experiments in content-centric networking. Well, yes, but there's a lot of other research areas that network researchers are interested in. You can see that wireless and mobility is a very, very important part right now. So Genie really should enable large-scale experimentation in new forms of wireless and mobility. A lot of people are very interested in highly reliable, highly robust versions of the internet. So that's another area we should really allow substantial experimentation. Sensors, I think many of us believe that sensors and actuators are going to become a key part of our lives going forward. So that too is an area that Genie really should support. Okay, so here's kind of the moral of this story. So Genie is meant to enable at-scale experiments, right? Fairly substantial scale experiments that may involve, say, tens or hundreds of thousands of people that may or may not be compatible with today's internet. It seems kind of arbitrary to say, no, they must be incompatible with today's internet. People have all different interests, so things that may or may not be compatible with the internet. Long-running, realistic experiments with enough instrumentation so that we can really collect some results. Opt-in, which is how we call real users joining Genie experiments. And substantial scale growth. But Genie itself is not an experiment, right? Genie is intended to be a fairly reliable infrastructure because, if parts of Genie are kind of bouncing up and down all the time, nobody will be able to run substantial experiments in it. So Genie has to be reliable enough so people can actually get their software out there, start getting an opt-in user base, and start getting some real substantial experiments going. Okay, this is a kind of a convenient breaking point. Do people have comments or, angry reactions about, what this thing is intended to do? Yeah.
Like, how different experiments of this method isolated from each other?
So how are experiments isolated from each other? It is going to vary in different parts of the network. In many of the core parts, you get pretty good isolation through commercial equipment. If you don't pay much money, you can use things like VLAN, which don't have particularly good experimental isolation. You pay a little bit more money, you can get things that actually have QoS guarantees. Various kinds of MPLS, for example, can do that. When you get off into wireless space, the isolation is going to be much weaker. So there's no kind of end-to-end one-size-fits-all. But in general, you have to have decent isolation in a lot of the network.
So you mentioned wireless cellular coverage in cities. How to get such spectrum beyond, let's say, what Wi-Fi offers?
Right. How do we get wireless cell phone coverage in cities beyond what Wi-Fi offers? The current approach is through Wimax, which I'll discuss. That's not a perfect solution, but it's better than nothing. So I'll get into that in some. And in fact, Orbit is the WINLAB folks here are leading that effort. Yep.
How do you plan to manage the priority of experiments and the people lining up between experiments?
Right. How are we going to manage the priority if people line up? Well, my first hope is that people will line up, right? And you'll see. I think things are looking pretty good in that space. If this becomes really, really congested and crowded, the classic answer is that there usually is a scientific advisory group that begins to do that. I don't know if we'll get to that space, if this will become a scarce resource or not. But that's the usual approach to handle it. So NSF, for example, would set up a scientific group to help prioritize. Yes, sir? What is the difference between this and Planet Lab? Planet Lab rides over the internet protocols. It rides atop IP. This is starting to push considerably farther down where people can experiment with things that are not IP protocols, that are variants of the IP protocols, that are somewhat different or that are totally different from the internet protocols.
There must be some kind of protocol that Genie has.
So Genie needs to be able to set up a space for people to experiment. And I think I have maybe a slide or two on how Genie itself works. But the goal is to let people program down to anything that fits in Ethernet frames, and then in parts of Genie to allow programming below that, down towards the physical layer.
What the customer user of Genie? Is it just academic environment, academic research, also industrial research?
So who is the customer? Is it academic researchers, industrial researchers? So Genie has suffered from mission creep, as I think of it sometimes. In early days, people proudly proclaimed that Genie would replace the internet, and that's kind of a hard job to sign up for, replacing the internet. So we have a pretty focused goal for this project, which should enable network science and engineering experimentation for NSF researchers. We are also very interested in industrial. I myself am an industrial researcher, so we're very interested in industrial researchers. If you think about this outside of the research area, everything that Genie thinks of as an experiment is in fact a service, right? In the commercial world, you would think of these as novel services. And so one of the goals is to have a fairly easy transition from wild experiment into at-scale deployment of novel services, right? But, what we focus on is make sure we have a good research environment for academic and industrial researchers. Yep.
So Europe has a similar program, I just forgot what it's named. Is there any cooperation between Genie and that European program? And the second question I have relates to, are there any plans to use LTE in addition to Wimax as a kind of aerial interface for cellular wireless experiments?
Right, so the first question is, does this have any interactions with the European? It turns out FIRE is the primary European effort in this. Yes, we do, and in fact, the Germans also have a national one, as do the Japanese, the Koreans, soon to be the Brazilians and Chinese, which I'll briefly talk about. Wimax we chose not for the technology. There's the big Wimax versus LTE battles. We are not taking sides in that, but we could get the spectrum and the equipment for Wimax. We would love to do LTE if we can get the spectrum and the equipment. Okay, let me press onwards. Let me tell you a little bit about the status and kind of our near-term future plans. So we're enabling two kinds of at-scale experiments. controlled and repeatable, right? Those would probably use traffic generators rather than real human people, as audiences. So controlled and repeatable experiments, so you can vary parameters and kind of get graphs out of them. And then in the wild trials of these, what I think of as kind of novel services, experimental services, with good enough instrumentation and data archival tools for both. And in fact, again, the WINLAB people have a very good line of thought on the instrumentation and experiment capturing version of this. A key question for us, for the GENI project office, is how are you going to build something as big as the internet? Right? I mean, that's clearly, nobody thinks we're going to build something as big as the internet. How are we going to build something of sufficient scale so that you can actually get results? How are you going to afford to build the thing, and how are you going to afford to operate it? Right? Actually, the operational costs would be much worse than the construction costs. And so the strategy we've chosen is we are trying to not build something parallel to what is going on. We are trying to GENI enable things that already exist. For example, the orbit test bed here, Planet Lab, EmuLab, but also campus networks, the national backbones, and so forth. So we call it G-enabling, but it's basically to open up infrastructure so in parallel you can run research experiments and production traffic, right? That way, for example, on a campus, if you can do this, you can get to every dormitory room in the campus. You can get to all the students through wireless. You can get to every classroom. But the infrastructure will be owned and operated by the campus IT staff. Right? So that's kind of our key strategy for how we're going to build this thing at a substantial scale. And you'll see that we're kind of heading down that path as we go. Because we're doing, a pretty substantial project that's pretty far out there, we could either kind of, wander aimlessly for 5 years and see where we got, or we can kind of make a series of forced marches. So what we're doing is, as fast as we can, we're getting stuff up and running and trying to use it. So we call this spiral development. This is the way I think people build systems, have built them for a long time. Build it as fast as you can, try using it from what you've learned, revise. Build more of the stuff you like, less of the stuff you don't like. You'll have some major insights, so that will give you a chance to change your mind. In GENI, the spirals are each 12 months long, basically October to October. And we're now about a year and a half in, something like that, in this process. So the folks here at WINLAB had several projects in Spiral 1, madly built them, demonstrated them, got people to use them, and so on. Now, based on that, we're trying to expand them. Actually, you'll see some of those were really very successful, and so we're replicating them across a number of campuses because they worked so well here. We'll try using those, and so on, right? This is our process. From my viewpoint in the GENI project office, the most important goal in Spiral 2, that is, from now to October, is to get real experiments running. Right? If you're going to build some prototype infrastructure and try using it, you better try using it, right? I mean, what's going to drive your design if you don't actually try it? And so experiments are what's going to drive GENI's design going forward. Then we have a number of kind of technical emphases, basically integrate the prototype a little bit better, get some interoperability up, considerably beef up the instrumentation, and so on, right? But the main thing is really get those early experiments running. Okay, and the other kind of key programmatic area that we're doing in GENI is we don't envision GENI as owned and operated by one group. 5 years ago, there was kind of an idea of a monolithic GENI. Somebody would own and operate GENI. Well, we now envision GENI will encompass a number of campuses. It'll encompass the 2 national research backbones. It'll encompass regional networks. It will encompass data centers and clouds that people are providing. Right? We will GENI enable all these things and then kind of glue them together and to form GENI. And you'll see, this is actually pretty far along, this particular plan. Explicitly, GENI slices will probably go off into other nation projects. So we expect to have GENI experiments that extend into Europe, Japan, China, and so on. And we think, it's still a little too early to say, that there will be Genie-compatible corporate infrastructure as well. Right? So the NSF part of Genie is only kind of part of this broader ecosystem that is the end-to-end Genie. The corporate parts, people might donate time or parts of it to NSF, or they might simply charge. Right? We're pretty open as to how the financing for that part would work. But we are interested in corporate aspects of Genie. Okay, I showed this chart before. This is kind of the current groups involved. If you're interested, on Genie.net, there's actually a wiki with kind of exhaustive, heavy detail for each one of these projects and what they're doing and who they are and how to contact them and so on. Because there are so many groups, and there's actually a fair diversity of opinion, surprisingly enough. You get together 50 research groups, you don't actually have monolithic opinion on how everything ought to be done. We've kind of roughly organized the projects into 4 competing clusters. So each of these clusters has one control framework. For example, the WINLAB one is here. It has one control framework that comes out of one group, and then a number of other projects that are in that control framework and interoperate with it. So we currently have 4 different ones, one based on Planet Lab, one based on EmuLab, which is called Proto-Genie, one based on Orca, which is kind of a grid scientific computing-based software, and OMF, which has a particular emphasis on instrumentation and on wireless aspects. And we are letting people kind of battle it out, right? What is more important? What's less important? Projects are free to join any cluster they want. They can switch clusters anytime they want. And we expect in the course of this year, these clusters will start to become interoperable. Right now they're not. If you're in this cluster, you can't use the stuff over in that cluster. But by the end of Spiral 2, we should start seeing the beginnings of interoperability. So it doesn't much matter whether you use this cluster or that cluster, you can still get your hands on the same stuff. We think that kind of decoupling really opens up the space for people who have good ideas about how Genie ought to be structured. The green stuff are things that they're either studies or things like security that cross all clusters. And so here's some of kind of the early infrastructure examples. They range from core optical nodes, the kind of stuff that you'd see in a regional network or in some parts of backbone networks, through racks of computers and Cisco routers and Ethernet switches. Vehicular networks, there's an extensive bus system, for example, in Massachusetts that's all part of Genie. A really kind of interesting outlier, a distributed weather radar system. This is, again, at the University of Massachusetts. It has a bunch of weather radars that are all looking in the sky, and you can kind of get a combined real-time 3D vision of what's going on in your nearby atmosphere. I think that's a pretty interesting entree into the sensor network space. The programmable routers, SPPs, these are kind of classic people who want to experiment with routing protocols and either variants of the IP architecture or entirely new architectures. And then the orbit test bed, of course. In addition, we have some pretty handsome donations out of Internet 2 and National Lambda Rail. 10 gigabits, it's kind of apples and oranges, but 10 gigabits national footprint out of Internet 2 and 30 gigabits out of National Lambda Rail, plus donations of their engineering staff, which is actually even more valuable than the national footprints. But this is how we're stitching Genie together, is we're Genie enabling these backbones and attaching the campuses to them and getting end-to-end Genie that way. Let me briefly talk about this mesoscale build-out. I'm going to just breeze through some slides here. But this is kind of ongoing work. This is what we're really doing right now. We are taking some of the campuses on this national footprint, and we're using commercial technology that's been Genie enabled to build out campuses. Why do we care so much about campuses? Well, I said we really, really want users. We want early adopters. We want those opt-in users. The easiest, fastest way, so this is answering your question, the easiest, fastest way for us to get our hands on a lot of real users is to Genie-enable campuses so that students at those campuses can live inside Genie experiments. So, you know, I have a kind of a primitive vision of this, but basically on your laptop or on your handset, channel A will be the internet that we all know and love. Channel B will be somebody's experiment, right? Could be Morley's experiment. It's somebody's experiment running on channel B. Channel C will be a completely different experiment. The user will think of these as services. Right? As far as they're concerned, it's just a different service. You know, they don't really care how it's implemented.
So they will get some sort of like an app.
I'm s-
So they will get this experiment, some sort of like an application, like
Right.
Apple app or something like that.
Right. It will probably run either, you know, in a separate freestanding application or inside a browser, something that people are used to. Right. So as far as they're concerned, you know, they'll never notice that they're using something that's not a standard internet thing. Yep. We would very much like end users to participate, right? Yep. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sensor networks.
Oh, sensor network. Yes, yes, yeah. I think all of us believe sensor networks are going to play a big role in the future. So it's people plus sensors. Okay. Yeah. Do we have operator interest in incentivizing use? I don't think we've gotten to that stage yet. The stage this is at is we're getting campus IT staffs to have equipment first, you know, in a rack or on a bench, try it, see if they're happy with it, familiar with it. If that seems okay, then try building out through one building in campus or one floor. Try, you know, building out the CS department. If that works, you know, try going to the dormitories. And so the level of comfort varies from campus to campus. For example, Georgia Tech is going right ahead and building towards the dormitories. Other places are, you know, a little more methodical. You can see at the bottom, this is the range of equipment. I think actually the Cisco has been replaced by, I can't remember what, something, not the Cisco, it wound up. We let campuses choose what equipment they wanted because every campus, you know, their IT staff has their favorite equipment. So we'd like to have an early version that's Genie enabled of equipment they know and like, let them use it for a while, and then, you know, they do equipment refreshes every so often. So as they begin to refresh equipment in their buildings, in the wiring closets, replace it with something that's the same equipment from the same vendor, but Genie enabled. Right? So that's kind of the path we're on. So you can see OpenFlow is a technology we're very interested in. We're going to hear an OpenFlow talk this afternoon. We're building out OpenFlow through a number of campuses, including Rutgers, and through the backbones, National Lambda Rail and Internet 2, kind of as we speak. We're also building out, and this is under WINLAB leadership, we're building out Wimax at a number of universities. It's the cheapest, easiest way to get, you know, real handsets with real programmable base stations. And finally, we're building out something called ShadowNet, which are Juniper routers, programmable Juniper routers with AT&T measurement framework. Those are going in the backbones. Right? So we're not putting all our bets on one technology. Right? We're trying a bunch of different technologies that are commercial and Genie enabled. I'm going to kind of skip over the deployment roadmaps. Basically, it is, you know, by November, this stuff had better be up and kind of limping in end-to-end integrated form, right? So this is all, basically it's happening in the summer. You know, that's the way academic schedules work, is everybody becomes free in the summer. So it's a lot of work over this summer. Wimax, you know, things are going in boxes. I can assure you, Yvonne, they're coming out of boxes on the other end. And ShadowNet is actually running a little bit slower. Their schedule is to get kind of, you know, early limited stuff up this year. Most of the action is next year in ShadowNet. I'm going to skip this. Basically, it's saying there's a lot of work to pull this all together. Let me just quickly breeze through. These are the kind of detailed maps that we're producing. This is not a complete set of maps, but we are trying to figure out exactly which equipment and which campus needs to be Genie enabled, and how do you plug that into the regional network and then plug that into the national network. Yvonne showed a picture of how this works with ION, right? And we're doing the same kind of thing for all the campuses. It's not enough to have kind of a Genie island, but you have to connect into your regional networks and through the backbones. And so, you know, at Clemson, Georgia Tech, Indiana, you know, and so on and so on. Oh, we're doing it BBN too, so we better have at least one of everything so that when people have trouble, we can help answer their questions. I wanted to spend a moment on the Wimax deployments. I'm not going to repeat what Yvonne said, but for those of you who are used to Wi-Fi, Wimax is actually kind of complicated. It's not a little box like this that's all shrink wrapped. It's these multiple big cardboard boxes from Yvonne. And, it's a little complicated. So we have to work with all the campuses about find the space on the roof, get the experimental spectrum, and so on, get this stuff up and operational. Here's kind of a parts list for the hardware. Some of it comes from Rutgers, some, the campuses are supposed to buy themselves. The software kit is actually, a critically important part of this. And here, NEC and WINLAB have worked very closely together to make this open, virtualized base station. We think this is one of the neatest things in GENI because U.S. researchers have never been able to program and operate their own base stations. Right? Now, with this, people will be able to write the software if they want to do different handoff algorithms or they want to do anything different. As long as the hardware supports it, they can run their own programs in these base stations and make them work. Yvonne, I think this morning you got, the miraculous first handset. Right? This has been you need the base station, the spectrum, and the handset. Right? So that's the miraculous third part of this triangle is Android handsets. So every part of this system is kind of open and virtualizable. So I think this is going to be really, really neat in the next year as we start to get substantial deployments of this. We unpacked ours right before the really, really big electrical storm, which mercifully I think we were grounded.
Not during.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it was. Okay, so we're building this stuff out through a bunch of campuses, the Internet 2 and National Lambda Rail backbones, and so forth. Okay, I'm going to speed up slightly. Do people have kind of questions? This is kind of what we're currently doing. Then I'm going to switch to, okay, now experimentation. Yep.
Apropos users and everything, you're talking about handset?
Yes.
User will have a dedicated handset?
It's not clear that, we want or can afford dedicated handsets for the users. So it would be very nice if we could get dual mode, right? This is what we're doing with every other part of GENI, is having something that runs production traffic and research traffic. This is wishing for something that's hard to find, right? We'll see.
I believe this may be some sort of the issue of realizing it. So how you interface with the user, to my opinion. Because otherwise, you just buy equipment, you deploy it, you have some researcher, student operating and everything. But how.
Well, we need everything to be open and virtualized, and getting an open base station is a trick and a half, right? A base station that a computer science researcher can program. So we've gotten that far, but we're not done, right? I mean, we're kind of 60% of the way towards having this whole thing in place. Okay, let me talk briefly about experimentation. So because, spiral development is driven by experiments, we've got 3 efforts in parallel to try to get people experimenting on this thing. So one is get the earliest experiments running right now, right? And so that effort actually started several months ago. Another is get training sessions going as quickly as possible so we can start to train young professors and graduate students on how to use this stuff. That began in March. There's a lot more training is coming online. I'll talk about that. And then there's an experimentation workshop at Princeton that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And that, too, is a way to try to, as quickly as possible, teach people how to use this and get people doing interesting research on it. Then, as Ray mentioned, there's also the Parallel NSF Future Internet Architectures program. So we've got 4 experiments that are currently in progress. One of them is a very interesting social networks project from Felix Wu. I'll just talk about this rather than talk about all of them. Basically, he says, well, what if the social relationship should absolutely drive the lowest levels of the network? Right? So he's, in some sense, turning the entire network stack upside down. Facebook and Facebook-like things will drive the way routers behave. We love it. Okay, so he's busy at work implementing this and trying this out in Genie. We actively help these PIs, right? I mean, it's very hard to do experiments in Genie right now. There's only kind of bits and pieces. So there's a lot of hand-holding that goes on. The training sessions are to train students and young PIs on how to use this stuff. We gave the first training session, actually John Turner of Washington University gave the first training session in March at our periodic Genie Engineering Conference, GEC. We're going to have 5 different training sessions come up in July in San Diego. And we expect we'll start funding people to do a fair number of these training sessions, curriculum development, and so forth. Yep.
Can the training sessions be put in iTunes?
Can training sessions be put in iTunes? Yeah, I imagine they could. So that's a good idea. We'll try to do that.
University.
Right. That's a very good idea. Yep.
The last example, the example is that a social network or anything else would drive the underlying network problem.
Yes, that is indeed what he's saying.
Would you conceive of, suppose it is successful, would you want to live in a world where social network or something else drives the underlying?
I think that's an excellent question. I have no idea which world I would prefer, right? I mean, right now I find it kind of unthinkable to even think the thoughts that he's thinking, right? We're used to the exact opposite of what he's thinking, right? So I love the idea that he's going to actually try this.
I think with all the talk about the need for security, it is a farthest thing in my imagination that one would want to have. If one wants some stability and some security.
Right. So let me throw in one more thing about Felix. So he does a lot of his research as Facebook applications. So he does applications. This is a kind of a thing we aspire to in Genie. He does applications which users think of as applications, but for him, he's getting research results out of them. So he's got more than a million users at present. So the goal on this is to take some of those applications and start using the million users as a way of driving the underlying network fabric. Is this a good idea, a bad idea? You have to argue with Felix about that. But I think it's a very interesting idea. Okay, let me plow on. Oh, this is the Princeton thing. We were hoping for about 40 participants. We got a ton of white papers, which actually made us feel very happy indeed. I think there'll be about 60 participants at this thing at Princeton in a couple weeks. The goal is people who have interesting research ideas that they think maybe could run in Genie somehow. Let's sit down, talk about it, kind of vet it, figure out, oh yeah, you could do this and this and this. Right? Here's how you could do it in Genie. So when Morley was giving her experiment, she's actually submitted a white paper as one of these many people, tried to help figure out what's the mapping. How would you implement this in Genie and actually try it out on a substantial scale? I don't expect anyone to read this, but these are kind of the people that are participating. I'm very happy we got a lot of the best researchers from the U.S. who are going to be showing up, figuring out how to do these experiments. Then there's the NSF Future Internet Architectures project that Ray mentioned at the beginning. These are going to be very substantial efforts. They are asked to do experimental work, right? Show your architecture in practice. They're not required to use Genie. We certainly will bend over backwards if anyone wants to use some or all of Genie to help teams. BBN, the company, is not participating in this, right? We're trying to stay fair and even-handed here, so we're not in any of these projects. We're just doing the Genie thing. Okay, so Spiral 2, we think, is a pretty big deal. By October, we're going to have 14 campuses, 2 national research backbones kind of stitched together, up and running in this form. Right? Oh, and I forgot to mention, Nick Feemster at Georgia Tech has rigged away his BGP MUX by which you can connect a Genie slice, an entire virtual slice, to the internet, right? At multiple places, so you can make things that are like autonomous systems in a relatively safe way, we hope, that are multiple connected, so they could be stub autonomous systems or transit autonomous systems. So that kind of opens up a lot of interesting possibilities for researchers trying to reshape the way the internet architecture works. Okay, looking ahead, I have a couple of Genie things and then a couple non-Genie things that I think personally are very interesting. I've been putting a pretty heavy emphasis on commercial equipment for mass-scale deployment. But we have kind of a portfolio approach there are a lot of wireless people at BBN. We believe the cognitive radio space is an extremely interesting and important space. And so we are very interested in having a bunch of cognitive radios that are built up and used at a number of research groups across the U.S. So we will see how this goes. I'm pretty optimistic this is going to turn out well. If we can get some of these working and people are happy with them, we'd love to get a lot more and get them into more hands out there. We have a solicitation that we put out about a week and a half ago for the next round of GENI funding. And we have 3 things that we're very, very interested in. The deadline for proposals is August 20th for anyone that might want to be on a team. One is we want to aggressively grow this mesoscale build. Right, so I mentioned we're building out through a bunch of campuses. We're building out Wimax. We're building out the Juniper routers and the backbones and so forth. Okay, we want to kind of enhance the regional and backbone builds substantially. So we currently have the 2 backbones and a little bit of a regional. We'd like to really flesh out the backbones and maybe add another 6 regionals to the system. We would like to have a substantial number of additional Wimax sites, especially if we can get kind of metro area coverage. Right now people tend to have individual base stations, but can we have enough base stations in a metro area so that you can exercise handoffs and so on?
Do you have industrial sponsors for Wimax like Intel or Samsung or players in Wimax field?
Right. The current industrial sponsor is NEC. If you have other favorites, I will go knock on doors and do what I can. The third thing that we're very interested in, this is something quite new, are we term Genie racks. And these are notionally, this is a pure notion, a rack of computers with a lot of storage and configurable switches that we can use for, as a content distribution node, a programmable router, a transcoding part, and we will populate these all through the backbones, the regional networks, and the campuses. Right, so this is really beginning to build out an infrastructure that can support very substantial experiments in content distribution, or all the other things you could do if you had your hands on a bunch of routers. I'll be very interested to see the proposals we get on this, but we are asking for a large number of these to be populated throughout Genie as quickly as possible. Second is an instrumentation system. We've got great instrumentation parts, but we need an overall system, so we're asking for that. Finally, experiment support, training, education, curriculum development, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I'm going to skip this. I'd like to just hit on a couple related activities, because these are not Genie activities, but to me they're really interesting. One is the stuff that's going on in the FCC, and so I think some of us in this room, in one way or another, have been interacting with the FCC about spectrum and things like, what do we as researchers want from the FCC? I have found them very, very open to discussing these. I think they would actually like to help the research community, if possible. Those of us who are installing these Wimax base stations, it is a miracle of how easy it is to get spectrum nowadays. You go to a slightly complicated website, you fill things out, you pay, I think, $60, something like that, and in 30 days you got your spectrum. So the FCC is really, at the moment, very interested in helping. And I think, we as a community should be thinking, if we really want to do cognitive radios, what do we want to ask for from the FCC? Because we should ask pretty soon. I've been in conversations with them do you want nationwide spectrum, a small amount? Do you want, a very localized spectrum, a big chunk? What do you want? So I would encourage everyone that cares about this, think about the FCC, because this is a great moment. Another really interesting thing, this is not a Genie thing, although we've been kind of participating, is a wireless national test bed. For those of you who are in the cellular business, this is an MVNO, a mobile virtual network operator. The notion is, can and should NSF stand up a nonprofit MVNO for research? Now, this is a really interesting idea, right? It's not clear it's feasible. It's not clear it makes sense economically or will have the research payoff, but I think it's a really interesting idea. It would be even more interesting, I've been having conversations with Clearwire. It'd be even more interesting if it were basically compatible technology with the Wimax base stations we're building. right? If we could have local researcher-controlled base stations, but then a substantial national backbone that was compatible, that would be really, really neat. So this is currently being disputed. You know, some people are in favor, some are against, but I find it an extremely interesting area. I've put down a reference at the bottom how you can find this if you're interested. And then finally, I think I mentioned there's a lot going on around the world. The green ones are projects with which we have existing relationships and are busy, you know, trying to get joint experiments going across our infrastructure. The yellow ones were probably a little bit a ways, you know, months rather than years away from coming to agreements with them on this kind of thing. Okay, many of you already are participating, but I hope there's some that would like to. So GENI is being designed and prototyped by the research community, academic and industrial. For those of you who are industrial, we are very happy to have industrial participants. You will be surprised to know that we will fund industrial participants. So, you know, if you donate your labor, we're really pleased, but if we think it's worth it, we will pay for your labor, for equipment, and so on. We would encourage you to join an academic-led team, right, but we would be very, very happy with industrial participation. I think we have a reasonable IPR thing. We ask no-fee licenses for use in GENI where you keep the rights, or if you want, you can put it in the public domain. Either way. If you're really interested, the next meeting is in San Diego, July 20th through 22nd. This is kind of the meeting of the entire GENI tribe. It's about 200 people or so that come together 3 times a year. There's big demo sessions, lots of arguments about how GENI should develop and so on. We do give travel grants to U.S. academics, and so if you're an unfunded U.S. academic, you know, send email. Usually everybody waits for the last second to apply for a travel grant, so if you apply now, your chances will be very good. And that's it. I'd like to encourage everyone here, if you're interested, please get involved. You know, nobody is standing in your way. We will actively help if you want to get involved. Thank you very much. Maybe there's time for one question, and then we should probably break for lunch. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that there's difficulty in measurements of the infrastructure, and I suppose we need measurements to look at the success of the experiments. Give us some thought of how we're going to measure various aspects of success.
Right. Well, I'm not sure if that's one question or two. You know, first we need measurements. We need to instrument everything so we can collect packet traces, RF power level. You know, it's kind of a variety of measurements you need. And then there's the question of how can you tell if GENI is a success? Is this one question in your mind or two?
Meant to be two, but yeah.
Right. So the first is, you know, I think Yvonne presented a fairly coherent measurement architecture. That's the kind of thing we don't currently have in GENI, and we would like one. So we're soliciting somebody, please implement this and deploy it. And we hope we get some competing bids, and we will fund multiple competing teams on that. So I'm pretty optimistic. The second is, how can we tell if GENI is a success? Well, you know, I think the first level of being a success is avoid being a complete fiasco. And, you know, I think we've kind of made it over that hurdle. A couple of years ago, it looked like it might be a complete fiasco. My definition of success is, can we really get the network science and engineering research community revved up and doing a lot of things, you know, actually having a big impact, right? I believe my community, the network research community, has kind of gotten to an impasse. We do a lot of work, but it's very, very hard to have a big impact on the world, right? Unless Cisco adopts it or what have you, you're doomed. So that is my own personal measure of success, and that's what we tell NSF. Okay, thank you very much.